What's going on, guys? It's Fight Season MMA, and today I want to make a video talking about the top 10 most impressive fighters of 2024. These are the guys. I know the year quite hasn't wrapped up, but there really isn't anyone who's fighting again on this list. There's one guy who is, but I'll kind of talk about already why he would be on this list. But genuinely, I want to talk about why these fighters deserve to be recognized for their amazing 2024 year. These guys have fought multiple times, got incredible wins, beating some incredible competition, and truly have shown the entire UFC organization why they are some of the best fighters in their respective weight classes. I know that there is so many different individuals who can get 2 or 3 wins, but possibly to get even more than 2 or 3 is incredibly exceptional, as well as to be incredible competition in a lot of different ways. So I kind of want to break down why that there is so many different individuals inside the UFC that have had such a great year, and that I wanted to make this video to highlight the top 10 most impressive fighters of 2024. But before we jump into the video, please leave a like, comment, and subscribe. That is the best way to help the channel grow. And while you're down there, please turn on the post notifications, just so you guys are always and fully notified about UFC content that releases every single day. But without further ado, let's jump right into the video talking about the top 10 most impressive UFC fighters in 2024. At number 10 most impressive fighters of 2024, I have Mr. Merab Dvalishvili. Merab Dvalishvili beat Henry Cejudo at UFC 298 in Anaheim, California, in a very good win. Cejudo is a little bit at the end of his career, but he went in there, lost the first round, dominated rounds 2 and 3, and showed why Merab Dvalishvili is an absolute cardio maniac in there. He then fought at the UFC Vegas Sphere event at UFC 306 and beat Sean O'Malley for the UFC Bantamweight title. Merab Dvalishvili has had one heck of a year, truly beating one of the UFC's greatest bantamweight flyweights ever inside the organization, and then going to beat the actual bantamweight champion. Now, I don't want to rank him a little bit higher because I do think that Sean O'Malley was a little bit overrated, and I do think that there are some other guys who have had better years than him, but Merab Dvalishvili has had an amazing 2024 campaign and definitely needs to recognize for his amazing year. I know Merab Dvalishvili is aiming to come back in early 2025, I believe, and truly I do think that I would love to see him fight someone like Umar Nurmagomedov in that, but ultimately, Merab Dvalishvili's 2024 was amazing campaign for him and a great year for him as a bantamweight in the UFC, becoming the new bantamweight champion back in September of this year. And genuinely, Merab Dvalishvili lands on my number 10 on my top 10 most impressive fighters of 2024 list. At number 9 most impressive fighter of 2024, I have Mr. Caio Borrahlo. Caio Borrahlo fought at UFC 301, KOing Paul Craig. I believe it was in the first round. It could have been in the second round, but KOing Paul Craig in the first round. Now, Paul Craig doesn't have an amazing chin. Great win, though, in my opinion, kind of getting and establishing yourself in the top 15. But the biggest thing and the most impressive win in Caio Borrahlo's career came in August of 2024, where he stepped in probably around 3 or 4 weeks notice, fighting Jared Cannonier, a savvy UFC middleweight veteran. And Caio Borrahlo looked better than ever before inside that main event, getting the win over Cannonier in incredible fashion. Genuinely, Caio Borrahlo is one of the most well-rounded UFC middleweights, and he's only been sharpening and more well-rounding his skills inside the organization as he's been practicing and fighting a little bit more. Truly, I do think the Paul Craig win is a good win inside the organization, but beating Jared Cannonier on like 3 or 4 weeks notice in a UFC Vegas main event is one of the biggest things that you could talk about. And I think that that win from Caio Borrahlo, even though it's not for a belt, even though he's one of the best fighters, and Cannonier might not be one of the best fighters, I do think that Caio Borrahlo had a better year than Merab Dvalishvili. I know Merab won the belt, but I am a massive Caio Borrahlo fan. I think that beating Jared Cannonier is a bigger achievement than beating Sean O'Malley for a stylistic matchup for Caio Borrahlo. That might just be a hot take of mine, but truly, I do think that Caio Borrahlo had a massive and amazing 2024 campaign, and I cannot wait to see him return in 2025. Ultimately, he lands on number 9 of this list. At number 8 most impressive fighter of 2024, I have Brandon Raw Dog Royval. Brandon Royval fought he turned right after his UFC 296 loss to Alexandre Pantoja, and came back in February of 2024 to fight Brandon Moreno in the main event in Mexico City, going into enemy territory. Moreno, the Mexican, had all the fans behind him in that main event, went in there and stole the UFC Mexico main event, and Brandon Royval got that win. He then returned in October of 2024, fighting Tatsuro Taira in an amazing bout, a very razor-close bout. Taira was an undefeated prospect, Brandon Royval said that he would be able to go in there and finish him within the first round. Wasn't the first round, it's a 5-round decision, but ultimately that went over Pereira, probably one of the best UFC flyweights the organization has right now, one of the hungriest, youngest, more skillful individuals. I think is a massive win for Brandon Royval. Truly, I think in Brandon Royval's future, he's either lining himself up next for a title shot, possibly with a Brandon Royval trilogy match, or even possibly a Henry Cejudo match at 125. Ultimately, Brandon Royval's UFC 2024 campaign and career was an amazing one, getting an incredibly massive victory coming off his UFC 296 loss against Pantoja, beating Moreno in Mexico City, and then beating probably the best UFC prospect in the UFC 125-pound division in Tatsuro Taira is ultimately an amazing way for Brandon Royval to conduct his UFC 2024 campaign. Ultimately, Brandon Royval lands at number 8 on my top 10 most impressive fighters of 2024 list. At number 7 most impressive fighter of 2024, I actually have Shara the Bullet Magomedov. And I do think that Shara Magomedov, fighting 3 times in a span of like 4 months, he fought at June 22nd in Saudi Arabia, August 3rd in Abu Dhabi, and August 26th in Abu Dhabi. Considering that he only has one eye, he can only fight in the Middle East. He tries to fight every single event in there, and he's aiming for a return on February 1st in Saudi Arabia. But Shara Magomedov has had an incredible year, had a great 3rd round TKO over Arman Tricoli. He beat Michelle Olashechuk at that UFC Abu Dhabi co-main event, and that was a great fight. He looked amazing in that one, and then possibly getting KO of the year over Armen Petrosyan with that double spinning back fist KO. That was one of the most impressive things I've ever seen inside the organization. And what's crazy is that he actually practices that type of stuff, those double spinning back fists and those crazy kicks and stuff like that. Shara Magomedov is just that creative inside the UFC octagon, and he's just that high level of a striker. And genuinely, I think that Shara Magomedov has had an amazing 2024 campaign. Now, the reason I can't rate him higher is he hasn't had the name recognition of some of the other guys who I have above him, but genuinely, Shara Magomedov is an amazing fighter in 2024, and genuinely his career is super young inside the UFC organization, and it's only going to grow as the years pass by. 100% Shara Magomedov slots in at number 7 for me. At number 6, I have Mr. Nassourdine Imavov. Nassourdine Imavov has fought 3 times this year against all ranked middleweights. Back in February, he fought Roman Dolidze in a UFC Vegas main event, getting a very dominant 5-round decision victory. Now, I can't even lie, he should have got a first-round KO. And there was another round that he should have got a KO in, but Herb Dean saved Roman Dolidze in that fight. Nassourdine Imavov looked sharp, absolutely incredible, and looked like a future middleweight star rising in that main event. Also, after that, he fought in UFC Louisville against Jared Cannonier. Cannonier's return fight after tearing his ACL. Cannonier looked super good in that fight, super sharp, being able to piece off, get his head off the middle line. But Nassourdine Imavov was the younger, faster striking prospect and got an absolutely incredible win against Jared Cannonier. I think it was by a 4th round KO or TKO. Now, it was a bad stoppage, but still, Nassourdine Imavov was winning that fight. And lastly, Imavov fought Brandon Allen at the end of September as the co-main event of UFC Paris. A fight that I should have been the main event of that card. Brandon Allen is an amazing fighter who is coming up on a win streak. Also, Nassourdine Imavov was on a win streak. So genuinely, I believe that this was an incredible fight, and Imavov got the win there for a 3-round decision victory. Ultimately, Nassourdine Imavov this year has established himself as one of the best top 5 middleweight prospects inside the organization. I do believe he's ranked number 4 in the UFC current middleweight rankings, and I think that he has a massive fight ahead of him, most likely with Israel Adesanya next, maybe as the co-main event at UFC Perth, or maybe the main event of UFC Perth. And genuinely, I think that he has a bright future behind him inside the UFC's middleweight division, and that's why I ranked Nassourdine Imavov at number 6 of top 10 most impressive UFC fighters of 2024. Number 5 most impressive fighter inside 2024, I have Mr. Renato Moicano. Moicano is the guy. He started off the year greatly as the co-main event of that Nassourdine Imavov versus Roman Dolidze card on February 3rd. He beat Drew Dober in a great co-main event of that one. Unanimous decision victory. He then fought at UFC 300 against a very dangerous Jalen Turner. Jalen Turner knocked him down in the first round. Should have followed up with ground and pound. Could have got Moicano out of there. But genuinely, guess what happened? Moicano reslasted. He got back up, and he got the 2nd round TKO over Jalen Turner. And as the main event of UFC Paris, Renato Moicano went in there and absolutely demolished Benoit Saint-Denis in one of the most one-sided rounds I have ever seen in the UFC, in the UFC's history. That round one against Benoit beat him up so badly that the doctors had to come in and stop it after the second round because Benoit could not see anything out of his one eye and could barely see anything about the other. Renato Moicano has had a great 2024 campaign, and he's looking to return as soon as possible. Apparently, he was offered the main event at UFC Tampa, a very interesting thing that could have happened, but genuinely, Moicano is looking to return in early 2025, and I do think that he is going to be a staple inside the UFC lightweight division, possibly fighting some massive names above him, or maybe even fighting Paddy Pimblett, who is a little bit below him. Ultimately, Renato Moicano had an amazing 2024 campaign, and that's why he slots in at number 5 on my top 10 most impressive fighters. At number 4, top 10 most impressive fighters inside the UFC in 2024, I have Mr. Diego Lopes. Diego Lopes has fought 3 times in 2024. His first fight was at UFC 300, where he fought Super Sadiq Youssef and knocked him out in the first round. An incredible victory. Sadiq Youssef is such a good fighter inside the UFC featherweight division. He then went to go, take this fight against Brian Ortega on about 2 weeks' notice at UFC 303. Ortega then pulled out of the fight with like a day before, and honestly, everyone would have been okay with Diego Lopes pulling out of that fight. But guess what happened? Dan Ige fought in on 4 hours' notice at 165 pounds after Diego Lopes cut the weight down to 145. He then said 150 would be good. And guess what? He weighed in at 165 to fight someone who didn't have a training camp. One of the baddest things, most impressive things any single fighter could do. And Diego Lopes ultimately beat Dan Ige in that co-main event of UFC 303. He then got his rematch with Brian Ortega at UFC 306 and absolutely demolished him in an incredible performance. And I think that it's lined up Diego Lopes to either get the title shot next or be placed into an interim title shot or get a number 1 contenders match for the UFC featherweight title next. Ultimately, Diego Lopes has had an amazing 2024 campaign. The win over Brian Ortega was absolutely massive. Fighting Dan Ige on like 2 hours' notice was also incredible, and that knockout win over Super Sadiq Youssef at UFC 300 was one of the most memorable knockouts of the year so far. Ultimately, Diego Lopes is a monster, and he's had an amazing 2024 campaign, and I put him at number 4, top 10 most impressive fighters of 2024. At number 3 most impressive fighters of 2024, I have Joaquin Buckley. Joaquin Numanza Buckley has fought 3 times in 2024 and has another fight scheduled headlining the UFC Tampa main event. I will kind of talk about that fight after, but he first beat Vicente Luque as the co-main event of the UFC Atlantic City card at the end of March. He then turned around like 6 weeks later to fight Nassourdine Imavov. You guys might not know who that is. Imavov is a 6'5" welterweight, an incredible prospect, and he went in there and Joaquin Buckley dismantled Imavov in incredible fashion, an incredible fight that I did pick Imavov to win, and Joaquin Buckley proved everyone wrong. He then fought recently at UFC 307 on October 5th as the featured prelim on that bout against Stephen Wonderboy Thompson. Was a very close fight. We didn't know who was going to win that one. We think Stephen Wonderboy Thompson was out ahead a little bit, but in that third round, Joaquin Buckley was the second person ever to KO Stephen Wonderboy Thompson in an incredible match. And to end off 2024, he has a fight with Ian Gary at the end of the year. An incredible bout at the main event of UFC Tampa, and genuinely, Ian Gary versus Joaquin Buckley is one of my most hyped fights of the year. I know Joaquin might not be as big of a name as some of these other UFC welterweights, but Joaquin Buckley has been on an absolute tear ever since moving down to the UFC welterweight division. Ultimately, truly, I think that Joaquin Buckley has had an amazing 2024 campaign, and a lot of people are sleeping on what he's done in this year. And genuinely, I think that him already getting 3 wins inside the welterweight division and being hungry to fight at UFC Tampa in that main event is an amazing way to show why Joaquin Buckley's UFC 2024 campaign was one of the best out of any single fighter within the organization, and that's why he is my number 3 most impressive fighter of 2024. At number 2, I have Alex Pereira. Alex Pereira has fought 3 times in 2024, and he now holds the record for most title defenses in the shortest span. I think it's 175 days, which he fought Jamal Hill at UFC 300, fought Yuri Prochazka at UFC 303, and fought Khalil Roundtree Jr. at UFC 307. He got KOs in all those victories. He's fought a total of like 6 rounds this year, which is something crazy. KO'd Jamal Hill in the first round, KO'd Yuri Prochazka 5 seconds into the second round, and KO'd Khalil Roundtree Jr. by body shot at the end of the 4th round in that UFC 307 main event. Alex Pereira has had an incredible 2024 campaign. Not only has he fought any single person the UFC has put in front of him, he's also saved all these cards. There was no main event at UFC 300. He stepped in to fight Jamal Hill in about 6 weeks' notice. Conor McGregor pulled out against Michael Chandler at UFC 303. He fought Yuri Prochazka on 2 weeks' notice, and kind of the same thing as UFC 300. UFC 307 didn't have a solidified main event, so Alex Pereira went in there going through sicknesses and visa issues and a bunch of different things, got the win, and looked better than ever against Khalil Roundtree Jr. at UFC 307. Alex Pereira has had one of the best years any single UFC fighter has ever seen, and genuinely, I think that Alex Pereira on the timeline had an impressive 2024 year, and I think that he probably should be UFC Fighter of the Year. I think that his achievements kind of going in that far notice, I think gives him Fighter of the Year, but most impressive wins, I think goes to one other guy that I'll talk about, is also in the Fighter of the Year conversation, but Alex Pereira is my Fighter of the Year in 2020 and 2024, and I think the reason he's Fighter of the Year is I think his opponents were a little bit easier, and he should have beat them all in incredible fashion, which he did, but doing it on such a very narrow timeline, doing it in 175 days and setting the record for most title defenses in the least amount of time is absolutely crazy in my opinion, and Alex Pereira 100% deserves to be on number 2 on this list. At number 1 most impressive fighter inside of 2024, I have Ilia the Matador Topuria. Ilia Topuria has only fought twice in 2024, but he first beat Alexander Volkanovski, who's one of the greatest UFC featherweights, if not the greatest featherweight of all time, KOing him in the second round. He went in there with all this confidence. He stole Volk's belt off the table in the press conference, and he was saying all this stuff of how he was going to KO Volk inside run. He didn't get that done, but getting a second round KO, I think, is incredible considering that Volkanovski is one of the best featherweights of all time. But then he just fought at UFC Abu Dhabi, UFC 308 in the main event against Max Holloway. Max Holloway, in my opinion, was a harder fight for Ilia Topuria than Alexander Volkanovski. I think Max Holloway's size, his kind of output of volume, and his iron chin made that a very hard matchup for Topuria in theory. But what did Topuria do? He went in there, started throwing the leg kick. We're getting rounds off Holloway, and ultimately he got the craziest left hook KO, in my opinion, right to Max Holloway's chin, being the first person to not only knock out Max Holloway, but knock down Max Holloway inside the UFC. It was an incredible left hook and genuinely one of the most beautiful hooks I've ever seen inside the organization, right up there rivaling some of Alex Pereira's hooks. Ultimately, Ilia Topuria had an incredible 2024 campaign, and even though he hasn't fought as much as some of these other fighters within the organization, I think the quality of his opponents was absolutely insane. I do think that Alex Pereira winning fighter of the year, though, 100% over Ilia Topuria, considering that he fought an extra person, even though I do think that Topuria's wins are more impactful, but I do think the timeline that Pereira did it was kind of more impressive in my opinion. But as just an impressive fighter, no one thought, except I really did think that Ilia Topuria would go in there and beat Max Holloway and Alexander Volkanovski, and he did. But to do it in that fashion was so impressive to me, and for him to do that in that way, 100% he deserves the number 1 spot on my top 10 most impressive fighters in the 2024 calendar year. Thank you guys so much for watching this episode of Fight Season MMA, and please let me know down below in the comment section what you think about my top 10 list of the most impressive fighters of 2024. I think that this is a very hard list to make, considering that the UFC 2024 year was a great year. We had great cards like UFC 308, UFC 300, probably the greatest card of UFC in UFC history. UFC 298 and 299 were all great fight cards, and genuinely UFC 2024 has been a great year full of fights, but there is only 10 fighters, in my opinion, who have had the great year to stand out against them all, and I truly do think that these guys from 10 to 1 all had amazing campaigns and were some of the most impressive fighters in 2024. Ultimately, I do think that the UFC is in good hands for its future. I do think that 2024 was a great year, and it only is going to lead for bigger things to come down in the future. And I do think that these fighters, especially Ilia Topuria, had incredible 2024 campaigns. Thank you guys so much for watching this episode of Fight Season MMA, and please leave a like, comment, and subscribe if you guys enjoy the UFC content. And while you're down there, please turn on the post notifications just so you guys are always and fully notified about when UFC content releases every single day. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll catch you guys very soon with more UFC content and news.